Australians have many symbols of their national identity. The Australian flag, the Commonwealth coat of arms, the Southern Cross, the kangaroo, the koala, the opal. But today I'd like to talk with you about a plant, Australia's national floral emblem, Acacia pycnantha. We all call it golden wattle. So I want to talk to you about our national floral emblem. By the time I've finished, I hope you'll know more about it, and in particular why this wattle was chosen. In fact, why any wattle was chosen. I mean, we have so many wonderful plants found only in Australia. And why, of more than 1,000 wattles we have in Australia, why this particular one? I want also to talk about the symbolism of the wattle blossom. And finally, I want to dispel that bead myth. And I think you know what I'm talking about. It certainly does interfere with our enjoyment of them. First Australians had many names and many uses for the wattles around them. We're still learning from them about how we can use wattles today. For example, wattle gums, you know, that clear gum that seeps out of the wattle stems once they're damaged, and the kids used to suck on like lollies. Well, they were used by first Australians as a tonic for stomach and indigestion problems. And this was copied by the British settlers who used to have them with milk before they went to bed. But now pharmaceutical companies are actually trying to commercialise them as a treatment for reflux. Seasonal markers. When wattle flowers on the Atherton tablelands in far north Queensland, it's time to go down to the coast to get the crabs because they'll be full of meat. Or in Victoria, when the silver wattle flowers along the rivers, it's time to go and catch eels. And of course, we use them as seasonal markers too. They let us know that spring is on the way. We know from our tribal elders that around 70 of the more than 1,000 wattles are safe to eat. And there are others that are poisonous. So you just don't go eating any wattle in your backyard. But today we know that the edible wattle seed is also high in protein and gluten-free. Wattle blossoms can help you sleep at night. Who knew? In Tasmania in 1830, George Robinson observed that the locals were gathering wattle to stick into their huts at night, and this was going to help them sleep. So maybe we should be trying that as well. But why do we call this huge group of native plants wattles? It's because the British settlers found a use for them too, and this gave them their English name. They called them wattle, after Wattle and Daub, because they used wattles or flexible sticks to make their first shelters. Here are some early Australian wattle and daub huts. Branches and saplings were cut and woven into wooden frames to create panels that they called wattles. This wattle work was then daubed with mud and dung to fill the gaps. And a hut could be built in a day and dried out that night by burning a fire inside. I mean, they were really quick, and they were so common in the early days of settlement. Various types of wattles were used for this work because they were plentiful and because their cut stems were so flexible. So now I want to talk about scientific names. And the name for wattle is acacia. And what does that botanical name mean? Actually, acacia is derived from a Greek word, arche, meaning a point. And this refers to very long, sharp spines found on the first species, Acacia nilotica, that was named. This was in 1773, just a few years after Cook sailed the Endeavour into Botany Bay. Of course, the name for the genus doesn't really describe our acacias, because although some are prickly, they don't have those enormous spines found on the African species. The species name, pycnantha, is also from the Greek, with pycnos meaning dense and anthos meaning a flower. So this name refers to the dense clusters of flowers that form each wattle blossom. So from now on, I'm going to talk about wattles and acacias interchangeably because they refer to the same thing here in Australia. There are nearly 1,100 kinds of wattle here, They've been evolving in Australia for more than 30 million years. This is the land of the wattle. Wattle's the biggest group of woody plants in Australia. There are more wattles than eucalypts. Wattles, as you know, are adapted to our land of extremes, from floods to droughts to wildfires. They're found everywhere across this continent, from the tropics in the north to the cool temperate forests in Tasmania, from the coastal beaches to the snowy mountains to the vast arid centre of Australia. You will find them. So let's talk a little bit about the special features that have helped them to become so widespread. Wattles are nitrogen-fixing legumes. They have a special relationship with the bacteria in the soil, and this can move into wattle roots to form nitrogen-fixing nodules. These make nitrogen available to the wattle as it grows, and then in turn, the wattles make the nitrogen available to the plants around it. We plant ornamental wattles, we plant them as visual screens and animal habitat in our gardens. We plant them around our parks, along our highways, and as part of species mixtures that are sown across huge tracts of land for soil and biodiversity conservation. Overseas, wattles are grown in plantations. They're our wattles, and they are used for many different products like wood pulp for paper making, solid wood flooring, shelving that we actually find in our hardware stores here in Australia, and kitchen platters, cutting boards, spoons, salad servers, all these kind of things that you actually find in the kitchen section of our supermarkets. Secondly, wattles have special foliage. They look like leaves, but they're not. They are modified leaf stems, and wattles have them in every shape and size and colour of green that you could imagine. The botanists call them phyllodes, and with their specialised cell structures, they can tolerate dry conditions and low phosphorus soils. Thirdly, wattles, with just a few exceptions, there are always exceptions, have very tough seed coats. This means that wattle seed can remain viable in the soil for decades, just waiting for the right conditions to germinate. And as you may have seen, they are the first to generate after fire or soil disturbance. They are pioneer plants. Wattles improve the soil, they are tough and resilient. You know, we haven't had a national floral emblem forever. I was a young scientist in 1983 at CSIRO Forestry in Canberra when, over morning tea, someone said, "You know, Australia doesn't have a floral emblem." We were all surprised and started musing about what would be a good one. Some of us knew that the states and territories had already grabbed their floral emblems, and they'd been around for decades. So it couldn't be the Queensland Cooktown orchid, or Western Australia's kangaroo paw, or New South Wales waratah. They'd already been taken. We mused on. What about the mighty river red gum? That grows all across Australia. Oh, no, not in Tasmania. What about the mulga? That's a wattle. That grows all across Australia. Oh, once again, not in Tasmania, and it doesn't grow in the ACT. What about a banksia? No one's grabbed that yet. Anyway, we actually couldn't think of one that was found in every state and territory of Australia. And obviously we thought that that was a very important thing for a national emblem to have. Now let me tell you more about Acacia pycnantha, the wattle that did become Australia's national floral emblem, even though it doesn't grow in every state and territory. It was proclaimed in 1988 in our national bicentennial year, and I'm going to tell you more about that later. But golden wattle is a small tree. It grows to about 8 metres tall, and it lives for, about 12 to 14 years as an understory tree in eucalypt forests. It's found only in Southeast Australia, from South Australia to Victoria and to New South Wales, and including the ACT. It grows on a variety of soils and can withstand frost down to about -6 degrees and tolerates relatively dry conditions down to about 600 millimetres per annum. It flowers in winter and spring, and as you can see, has bright yellow ball-shaped blossoms. Each of those balls has an amazing 50 to 80 little flowers in it. By sheer coincidence, it actually flowers on National Wattle Day, the 1st of September, that we call the first day of spring here in Australia. Golden wattle was a colonial wattle of commerce in southeastern Australia. There were two of them, golden wattle and what we call black wattle, Acacia mearnsii. And in the 1800s, their bark was used to tan cattle hides to make really good leather. Golden wattle bark was found to be, in fact, one of the richest sources of tannin in the world. And it wasn't long before we started to export it to England. And it wasn't much longer after that in fact, seed was distributed to other countries around the world, countries that would become competitors to us for our black wattle and golden wattle bark. Now, the demand for all this hand-stripped wattle meant that the barkers often went ahead of settlers around the colonies, stripping the trees of their valuable bark before the landowners could stop them and actually use the bark to make money for themselves. In this photo on the right, you can see the tan yard workers all standing in front of an absolutely huge pile of wattle bark, waiting to be chopped up and crushed to be used in the tannery to preserve hides. Each year, bark was stripped from hundreds of thousands of golden and black wattle trees to keep Australia's colonial tanneries going. Both these barkers in these photographs are stripping bark from black wattle. It's a larger tree than golden wattle, but the technique is the same. In our world now, with plastics and synthetic tannins and vehicles, it's hard to imagine how crucial leather was in the horse-drawn society of the 1800s. Wattle bark tannin was used to preserve leather for saddles, reins, straps, belts, shoes, laces, rifle slings, pulleys, and pump and suction washers. So how did Acacia pycnantha become the national floral emblem? Well, it had a lot to do with the members of the Australian Natives Association. They proposed it about 130 years ago in the early 1890s. Certainly it looks good with its big, beautiful, bright yellow blossoms and handsome dark foliage, and it has a lovely scent. And as you've seen, it was a very valuable resource for the leather industry in colonial Australia. But perhaps the most important thing of all for the selection of a wattle for our floral emblem was that wattles in general were common, widespread, found across all the colonies of Australia. It was a unifying symbol. In 1891, a member of the Australian Natives Association proposed the wattle tree as a national emblem. I quote, "The wattle tree was a native plant in all states of Australia. Its bark was valuable for tannin hides, and its blossom was uniquely spectacular." End of quote. Later, the association said that wattle in all its varieties was accepted as the Australian floral emblem, the golden wattle naturally gaining preeminence because of its universality. Well, as we know, Acacia pycnantha does not grow across Australia, but maybe they meant all the wattles that had foliage like it, not the 70 or so that had true leaves that actually looked rather fern or feather-like. One of the key movers of the Wattle Day movement, Will Sowden, wrote in 1913 in his History of Wattle Day, "The well-established fact is that the public wattle wearing on September the 1st, 1910, was the first of an organised kind on a definite day ever witnessed in Australia." There is no doubt that the sight of wattle in generous and full flower can arouse all sorts of feelings, and I think these were well described on the first Wattle Day. Again, I repeat, September the 1st, 1910, And in the Sydney Morning Herald, it was written, "To many Australians, the wattle stands for home, country, kindred, sunshine and love. Every instinct that the heart most deeply enshrines." Will Sowden founded the Wattle Blossom League in 1889. And in fact, it's interesting to note that decades later, Australia's Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Andrew Fisher, was in Adelaide in 1912, as you can see in this photo, for the celebration of Wattle Day. The following year, Fisher was the key speaker at the first conference of the Wattle Day League that was co-founded by Will Sowden. The first federal Wattle Day League conference was held in Melbourne on January 8, 1913. It was formally opened by the Australian Prime Minister, the Right Honourable Andrew Fisher, and he spoke in the warmest terms of the objects and achievements of the League. He reminded the company, who heartily applauded the references, that he had already given practical proof of his sincerity in connection with the Wattle Day movement by securing, through an alteration in the original design, the special representation of the blossom in the Commonwealth coat of arms. And I'll show you a picture of that later. There is no underestimating the importance of this Australian Natives Association. And it was called Natives because it was for native-born white men. It was a non-partisan and non-sectarian organisation. It was established as something that was called a friendly society. And by 1910, it had actually developed into a nationwide association with real political and social influence that continued up until the 1930s. And as you can see, it was a training ground for our prime ministers, although Andrew Fisher wasn't formally a member. Here we have it, the Commonwealth coat of arms. King George V granted the warrant for this on the 19th of September, 1912. Now, that was just a few weeks after we saw that photo of the Prime Minister standing next to Will Sowden. Andrew Fisher said, when questioned about the appearance of wattle, in fact, some people were critical that it looked like the emu and the kangaroo were actually up a wattle tree. But Fisher replied that the wattle decoration is emblematic of Australia, and that was all that was required. Now, Sowden also said later that the blossom represented the golden fleece, the golden grain, the golden sunshine, the golden hearts of Australian people, and the golden opportunities before our people. I think a lot of us feel those same sentiments today, certainly in terms of our optimism and opportunities. Now, wattle, in all its forms, was the symbol of Australia. And here we have, in fact, the second Commonwealth stamp ever produced. And you can see that up in the corners, there are some wattle blossoms, and the foliage is the fine feathery type, the fern-like foliage that's called bipinnate by the botanists. Different colours and denominations of this same stamp continued for decades, as did the presence of wattle on people's letters and packages. Wattle was certainly a symbol of Australia, if not the floral emblem at this stage. I'm now going to leap through the decades just to show you how wattle has been represented and embraced, certainly by the royal family. And here we have the coronation gown that Queen Elizabeth wore. She had embroidered on it all the symbols of the Commonwealth, and somewhat controversially at the time, because South Africa really wanted it, wattle represented Australia. And no doubt you are familiar with this iconic wattle dress that the Queen wore during her first visit to Australia in 1954. Absolutely gorgeous, painted later by William Dargie. And those paintings of the Queen in her wattle dress again became iconic. You probably remember on the walls of your post office or in the council offices or in your school, but certainly in my school. So that wattle dress said to us all that wattle was a symbol of Australia. This is a little bit funny. The Australian government gave a wattle brooch to the Queen during this famous 1954 tour of hers. And I say it's funny because if you look closely at the brooch, there are actually 3 large tea tree blossoms with wattle around the side. But we don't call it the tea tree blossom brooch, we call it the wattle blossom brooch, the wattle brooch. And I think this is just so wonderful. You can see that the wattle blossom, just a single wattle blossom, was the inspiration for the beautiful insignia for the Order of Australia. That's our highest recognition for outstanding achievement and service in this country. A couple of years after the Order of Australia insignia was designed by the famous Australian goldsmith Stuart Devlin, he was the one who actually designed all our wonderful decimal currency as well, a sprig of wattle was included in the crest of the Governor-General of Australia. I mean, looking at the crest and then looking at a sprig of golden wattle, you've got to wonder whether in fact they're one and the same. But I haven't been able to find any records of that, so let me know if you do. I just want to include here a reference to our national colours. Australia's national colours of green and gold, proclaimed by the Governor-General of Australia in 1984, were all about our sports-mad Prime Minister, Bob Hawke. Everyone else was expecting it to be blue and gold. But no, Bob Hawke wanted it to be green and gold, and for us to associate it with our sporting achievements. And in a lot of the correspondence at that time, there was no reference of it reflecting the colours of the wattle. Now, in 1988, Australia finally had an official national floral emblem. That was in our bicentennial year. It was a time when Australian identity was very much on the agenda of the government of the day. But it was a school teacher, Maria Hitchcock from Armidale in New South Wales, who started a grassroots movement together with the radio broadcaster Macca, from Ian McNamara from Australia all over, and the committed members of the Australian Native Plant Society who pushed golden wattle over the line. On the 1st of September 1988, it all happened. And here's a picture of the ceremony that was held at the Australian National Botanic Gardens. And there's Hazel Hawke, the Prime Minister's wife, who picked up a spade and did the shovel work when she planted the first golden wattle as Australia's national floral emblem. It was official. Not just any wattle, or the many different kinds of wattle that we all call golden wattle just because they've got yellow flowers. It was a specific wattle. It was Acacia pycnantha. Why? Well, we've already talked about that. It was beautiful. It had a rich history. And it represented acacias that were found in every state and territory of Australia. Now, here is our highest denomination banknote, the $100 note. Now, look, all of them actually feature wattles, but the floral emblem was saved for the highest denomination. And this one was actually issued in 2020. You may not have seen what else happened in 2020. $10 million and 2 years of research had gone into identifying something new and different for Australia as an international trade symbol. It was called the Nation brand, and it was produced by Austrade. In fact, it's sort of very similar to our Order of Australia, but no one commented on that at the time. They were too busy saying that it actually looked like COVID. And it received such criticism that they withdrew it. We now have another version of the kangaroo as our Nation brand. The timing was unfortunate because this symbol had a very rich meaning that was relevant to all that Australia had to offer beyond our kangaroos and our beautiful tourist spots. It was also about education and technology. Anyway, it didn't get up, and we're not seeing it. I'd like to talk to you about what we, the Wattle Day Association, believe the wattle blossom symbolises. When we, the Wattle Day Association, talk about the wattle blossom, we also talk about the qualities, the characteristics of Australians that we value and display, that are represented by the wattle. Optimism, that bright burst of colour. Resilience, wattles come back after difficult times like drought and flood. Renewal and regeneration after winter or fire. These are all characteristics that we value in each other. Diversity. I've spoken about how wattles are this huge group of incredibly diverse species, but they're all called wattle. We are one and we are many. That's how we Australians like to see ourselves too. And unity. We may come from different backgrounds and live in very different places, but we are all Australians, like the wattle growing around us wherever we live. It is something we all share. And what about the myth, I hear you ask? Okay, look, wattles have been unfairly accused of causing hay fever and asthma. People have the distressing symptoms of an allergic reaction. They look around, they see the wattles flowering in all their glory, and they conclude the obvious. But no, wattle pollen is just too heavy to make it into your airways. And all the wattles are insect pollinated. This means that their heavy pollen is moved around from flower to flower and blossom to blossom, plant to plant, by animals such as bees and flies and beetles, moths, birds and bats. Wind-pollinated plants, they're the problem, introduce grasses and trees. They shed large amounts of very, very fine pollen that is so light, it just floats up in the air. It's picked up by wind, moved around, and that's how fertilisation takes place. They are wind-pollinated. And so don't blame the wattle. It is very, very unlikely to get up your nose. So just to recap, we have romped through history with a focus on why a particular wattle, Acacia pycnantha, became Australia's national floral emblem. I hope you have some sense now of how wonderful our wattles are in their seemingly infinite variety and their ability to survive and thrive across this ancient, dry, eroded continent we call home. You may be more aware of their myriad of uses to the modern day. I have illustrated how golden wattle continues to be a popular and meaningful symbol of Australia for all Australians. And finally, remember, wattle pollen is too heavy to float into your airways to trigger your allergies. Thank you very much.